There was a time when Paul Gascoigne was not just a player, but the soul of English football, a name that made entire stadiums fall silent before erupting in endless cheers. He began his professional journey at Newcastle United, where his natural talent quickly made him the shining jewel of foggy football, before stepping up to a new level at Tottenham Hotspur, where he made a major contribution to helping the team win the FA Cup in 1991 and became England's Player of the Year. His ball handling was not only effective but also artistic, as if he was telling a story with his feet. On the international stage, he was the center in England's journey to the semi-finals of the 1990 World Cup. Honored in the tournament's all-star team, then continued to leave his mark at Euro 1996 with one of the most beautiful goals in the tournament's history, when he lobbed the ball over the Scottish defender before a delicate finish. Later, in the colours of Rangers, he won several domestic titles and was voted Scotland's Player of the Year. The titles may not have been as many as some other legends, but their value lay in the way he won them, with pure creativity, with genuine emotion, and with a talent that no system could create. But behind all those brilliant moments was a life that had never truly been peaceful. From when he was still a boy, he had carried psychological wounds that no one saw, nameless fears, haunting memories that could not be erased, and when the stadium lights went out, those things returned even stronger than before. Serious injuries had not only taken away his physical strength but also shattered the fragile stability in his mind, leading to months immersed in alcohol, in desperate efforts to forget the inner pain. He had tried many times to stand up, entered rehabilitation centers, searched for a chance to rebuild his life. But each time was a new battle with himself, a battle with no audience, no applause, only silence and repeated failures. And what made his story heartbreaking was not that he had stumbled, but that he had never stopped trying to stand up, even when the world no longer waited for him anymore. Because deep down, Paul Gascoigne was still a man carrying a strange willpower, a desire to live, to overcome, even though that path had never been smooth or complete. If this story touches you, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way for us to continue the journey behind the tears that have never stopped. Because in the next journey, you will see a child who had to carry too much pain from long before the whole world knew his name. After the moment the whole world saw Paul Gascoigne burst into tears on the pitch, few could imagine that those tears did not begin from a match, but had accumulated from long ago in an incomplete childhood in Gateshead, where his early days were not tied to peace or protection, but to deprivation. The noisy sounds of working-class life, cramped houses, and an atmosphere where emotions were rarely heard. There, a child learned to grow up not through guidance, but through endurance. Paul was not a standout child in the way people expected. He did not have emotional stability, was often impulsive, laughed easily, but also easily fell into emptiness. And then an event came too early, too cruel for a still tender soul. When he witnessed the death of his best friend with his own eyes, an accident that happened right in front of him, fast enough that he could not understand what was happening, but slow enough to etch an image that never faded into his mind. It was not only a loss, but a psychological shock that a child could not handle on his own. From that moment, the world around Paul was no longer the same. Familiar streets became frightening. Moments of silence became heavy, and in long nights, that memory returned like a nightmare with no escape. He began to startle at the smallest sounds, began to fear when no one was beside him, began to feel uneasy even when there was no clear reason. But in a family that had to struggle day by day to survive, those changes were not seen as a cry for help. His parents were not cold people, but they were not equipped to understand what was happening inside their son. They saw a mischievous child, sometimes hard to control, but did not see the pieces gradually forming in his soul. There were no deep enough conversations, no healing, only time passing, and a child gradually learning to keep everything inside. Paul began to laugh more in crowded places, but became more silent when alone. He learned to hide his fear, learned to turn chaotic emotions into impulsive actions because that was the only way to release them. But the more he tried to hide, the more those emotions accumulated, becoming harder to control. And then, amid all that chaos, football appeared not as a choice, but as an instinct. He ran after the ball as if running away from himself. Every touch of the ball brought a clear feeling that life could not give him. Every movement made him forget the haunting memories, at least for a short time. On the pitch, he was no longer the frightened child, but became someone who could control the rhythm, control the space, control himself. And that brought a rare feeling of freedom that he could not find anywhere else. But that very dependence gradually formed a dangerous connection. Because when football became the only refuge, everything outside it became more frightening, more pressured. And every time he left the pitch, the shadows returned, stronger, clearer. Paul did not have the chance to learn how to face his own wounds. He only learned how to temporarily forget them. And over time, that avoidance did not make them disappear, but only made them grow deeper, harder to control. Anxiety manifestations became more frequent, panic attacks appeared suddenly, and his emotions began to swing between extremes that even he could not explain. But from the outside, people only saw an energetic boy, playful, sometimes excessive, and that very misunderstanding made him continue to be left alone in his inner battle. No one stopped to ask how he really felt. No one was close enough to realize that behind that smile was a pain that had never been named. And as the years passed, the only thing Paul carried was not only increasingly clear talent, but also an invisible burden, a quiet but persistent instability, a part of him that had been damaged too early and never really had the chance to heal. And it was from there that his journey began, not only as a player, but as a person trying to find a way to survive with what had happened inside his own soul. As the teenage years gradually passed, Paul Gascoigne did not step out of childhood with the peace that many still imagined. He stepped out with a mask, a wide smile, non-stop jokes, and a source of energy that made anyone around pay attention. But few realized that behind that humor was not joy, but a way to hide things he could not name. Every joke was like a shield, every laugh like a way to postpone fear. And the more he laughed, the less he had to face the voids inside himself. That made him special in the eyes of others. An approachable, fun guy who always brought laughter to the locker room. But that very thing also made no one think he needed help. Because in their eyes, a person who always laughed could not be someone who was hurting. And when he joined Newcastle United, everything became clearer. His talent exploded almost immediately. Instinctive ball handling, bold passes, the ability to read the game as something natural, all made him stand out among other players. Not because he followed tactics perfectly, but because he played in a way no one could predict, as if he was reacting to emotion rather than thinking. And that very thing made the fans love him. But at the same time also made those around him worried, because along with that talent was an unpredictability in behavior. Paul could be the happiest person in the locker room in the morning, but become silent and distant only a few hours later. He could laugh loudly at a small joke, but could also get angry over an insignificant detail. Those changes did not follow rules, could not be predicted, and gradually became a familiar part of the way people saw him. Not as a sign that needed attention, but as a personality trait, an eccentricity that people accepted because he was too talented to be questioned. In training sessions, he could show genius moments that left everyone stunned, but there were also times he lost focus completely, as if his mind was somewhere else, far from the pitch, far from reality. And no one really knew what he was thinking in those moments. Coaches saw potential. Teammates saw an interesting friend. The media saw a rising star, but no one saw a person struggling with emotions that even he did not understand. There was no mention of psychological support. No one stopped to ask whether all those behaviors were just personality or signs of something deeper. Because at that time, psychological issues were never taken as seriously as today, especially in the football environment, where strength was valued more than fragility. And so Paul continued through the early years of his career with the same way of facing things, laughing when he needed to cry, joking when he did not know what to say, hiding when he could not face it. And over time, that instability did not disappear. It only became more complex, tied to his growing fame. Every good match made him praised more, but also brought more expectations. Every small mistake was magnified, every action off the pitch was scrutinized. And while the outside world began to see a special talent, a player who could change the course of a match with just one moment, inside, Paul began to feel more clearly the swings he could not explain. There were days he stepped onto the field with absolute confidence, playing as if there were no limits. But there were also days he felt empty, disconnected, as if everything around became strange. Those changes were no longer fleeting moments, but began to appear more frequently, more clearly. But once again, no one stopped to look deeper, because on the pitch, he still shone, still left his mark, still brought victories. And in the world of football, as long as you still played well, everything else seemed unimportant. The locker room was still full of laughter when he appeared. His jokes still amused his teammates. But amid that laughter, there were still moments when he fell silent, staring into the distance as if trying to hold something from breaking. And no one really asked why. No one really wanted to break the image they were trusting, because it was easier to think that it was just personality, just part of that special person, rather than accepting that perhaps he was needing help. Fame continued to lift him higher. The FA Cup in 1991 became the first peak in his career, a major title, an important milestone. And for many, it was confirmation that he had truly stepped into the ranks of great players. But for Gascoigne, everything was not that simple, because even in the most successful moments, he still did not feel complete. There was still an emptiness that could not be filled, a feeling of unease creeping in, even when everything around was perfect. And that very contrast between the outside image and the inside feeling began to become clearer than ever. The world saw magic in every run of his, but no one saw the cracks spreading inside. No one realized that every match was not only a challenge of physical strength or technique, but also a battle to keep himself from collapsing. And while the applause grew louder, the gap between the real person and the image he had to maintain grew wider, creating an invisible pressure that he had no way to release, no place to unload. And when everything continued to pile up, little by little, the inevitable began to form. Because no person could live forever in the separation between what they were and what the world expected. And for Paul Gascoigne, the price of the magic he brought to others was gradually becoming a burden that he himself had to bear alone. By the summer of 1990, when Paul Gascoigne stepped into the World Cup semi-final in the colors of the England national team, he carried not only the talent of one of the best midfielders in the tournament, but also everything that had accumulated from the years before. The expectations of an entire nation, non-stop praises, and the invisible pressures he had never learned to face. The match was tense to the point of suffocating. Every ball carried decisive meaning. Every run was watched by millions of eyes. And then that moment happened. A foul, a quick decision by the referee, a yellow card pulled out, a seemingly small detail in a big match. But for Gascoigne, it was not just a card. It was confirmation that if England advanced to the final, he would not be there. And in a brief second, everything he was trying to hold inside suddenly became too heavy, too much to bear. He did not shout, did not react violently, but just stood there, his eyes gradually turning red, and then the tears began to fall. Unstoppable, impossible to hide. In front of tens of thousands of spectators in the stadium and millions watching on screens, one of England's most talented players had cried like a child. And that moment immediately became a symbol, not because of weakness, but because of the rare honesty in a world that always demanded control. The audience felt their hearts tighten. They saw a human being, not a star. The media immediately called it the Tears of England, turning him into a symbol of emotion, of passion, of a generation of players who dared to show what they truly felt. But in all that praise, one thing was overlooked. No one really asked why he cried. No one stopped to think that perhaps those tears did not only come from the match, but from a much deeper place. Because for a person who had gotten used to suppressing emotions since childhood, bursting into tears in public was not a normal reaction. It was the breaking of something that had existed for too long, too heavy, memories of childhood, nameless fears, unnamed emotions. All seemed to find an outlet in that moment, and the pitch, which had once been where he found control, now became the place where he could not hold himself together. The irony was that that very moment made him more loved than ever. The fans not only saw a talent, they saw a person, they saw a part of themselves in that fragility. But that love also carried a misunderstanding, because they thought they had understood him, while in reality they only understood the moment. They did not understand the journey that led to that moment. They did not understand that behind those tears was an entire life that had to endure too much. And after the match, when the lights went out, when the cheers gradually settled, Paul Gascoigne did not carry the relief of a person who had released his emotions. He carried the emptiness of a person who had just revealed something he had tried to hide for too long. And from that point on, his image was no longer just a talented player, but became a symbol of emotion, a symbol that people looked at with admiration. But no one really stepped in to understand, and in that admiration, in that praise, there was an invisible gap between the real person and the image the world saw. A gap that grew larger and larger, and that very gap made what was happening inside him even lonelier than ever, because when the whole world believed they had understood you, that was also the time when you no longer knew what more to explain. And for Paul Gascoigne, the day the whole of England cried with him was also the day no one really understood how long he had already begun to lose control. The tears of 1990 had barely dried when 1 year later, as Paul Gascoigne stepped into the 1991 FA Cup final in the colours of Tottenham Hotspur, he carried not only talent at its peak, but also an invisible pressure that grew heavier on his shoulders. And in a moment that seemed like just an ordinary ball, when he charged into a challenge with all the determination that had become instinct, his body suddenly betrayed itself. The collision happened in an instant, but its consequences stretched for many years afterward. His knee was seriously injured, an injury that not only forced him off the field immediately, but also interrupted the brilliant trajectory of his career. That moment had no cheers, no romance of a beautiful play, only a heavy silence when everyone realized that something had truly broken. For Gascoigne, it was not just a physical injury, but the first time he had to face the possibility that the only thing helping him keep balance, football, could be taken away. And from that second, a new fear began to form. Not fear of failure on the pitch, but fear of losing himself. The treatment process dragged on longer than he could imagine. Complicated surgeries, days in the hospital with non-stop pain, recovery sessions where every step felt like a battle. And while the body tried to heal, his mind fell into a dangerous void. With no more matches to distract attention, no more familiar rhythm of the pitch, he had to face himself directly, with thoughts he had always tried to avoid before. And to cope with the physical pain, he began to use painkillers. At first it was only as prescribed, as part of the treatment process. But gradually, those pills not only helped reduce the pain in his knee, but also soothed somewhat the instability inside, creating a temporary feeling of relief that he had never had before. And that very relief became dangerous, because it opened an easy escape, a way not to feel too much. At the same time, alcohol began to appear like a familiar friend, not immediately becoming a problem, but creeping in slowly, from evenings to forget the pain, to times of drinking to sleep easier, to not think too much, to not remember what was happening. And over time, the boundary between coping and dependence became blurred. While on the outside, everyone still waited for the return of a star, inside, Gascoigne began to feel he was gradually slipping away from the person he once was. Every day without playing was a day he felt he was losing a part of his meaning. Every difficult step reminded him that his body was no longer as before, and the greatest fear was not whether he could play again or not, but if there was no more football, who he would be. Because for many years, he had built his entire self around that game. And now, when that foundation shook, everything else also began to tremble along. The long nights became heavier, the thoughts became more chaotic, and in the loneliness of the recovery process, with no cheers, no lights, only silence and questions without answers, Paul Gascoigne was not only trying to heal an injury, he was trying to hold on to himself while everything around gradually lost its familiar shape. And it was in this period that the seeds of a longer, harder battle had been sown. A battle that no longer took place on the pitch, but took place inside his own mind, where there were no clear rules, no specific opponent, and also no easy victory waiting ahead. After the long months of struggling with injury and the feeling of losing himself, Paul Gascoigne left England to begin a new chapter at Lazio. A decision surrounded by great expectations, where people believed that a new environment could help him start over, help him find his form again, find himself again, and perhaps even the peace he had never truly had. Rome welcomed him not only as a player, but as an icon, a talent from English football, a star that fans hoped would bring new light to the team. But right from the first days, that glamour was quickly replaced by a hard-to-describe feeling of strangeness. Language became the first barrier. Simple conversations became difficult. Jokes that had once helped him connect with everyone no longer worked. Cultural differences made him feel like he was standing outside a world he could not step into. In the locker room, where he had once felt most comfortable, it now became silent for him, not because people did not welcome him, but because he did not know how to fit in. And when training sessions ended, when everyone returned to their own lives, Paul often remained alone, in a strange room, in a city he did not really understand. The feeling of isolation did not come suddenly, but crept in little by little, in meals with no one to talk to, in long evenings with no familiar laughter, in days when he felt he existed but did not really belong anywhere. And in that void, alcohol once again appeared, this time not only to reduce pain, but to fill the silence, to soothe the feeling of being lost, to create an illusion that everything was still okay. At first, it was just small glasses after training, then gradually became a habit, a part of every day, a way to start the evening and also a way to end it. And over time, alcohol was no longer a choice, but became a need, because when sober, the thoughts returned stronger, the uncontrolled emotions became clearer, and drinking became the only way to slow everything down. On the pitch, he still had moments that reminded people of his talent, still had plays that showed he had never lost that special ability. But the stability was gone. The performances became inconsistent. There were matches where he shone, matches where he almost disappeared. And that began to affect the way people saw him. From a great hope, he gradually became a question mark, a player no one could predict. And while the media began to question his form, his attitude, his ability to adapt, inside, Paul was facing a battle that no one saw. Every passing day was an effort to keep balance, to not slip too far. But the more he tried, the more he felt himself being pulled down. The gap between him and the world around grew larger, not only a geographical distance, but an emotional distance. He no longer felt connected with teammates, with fans, even with himself. And the most painful thing was that there was no specific moment to point out where everything began to go wrong, only a slow process, where each small part of life was separated, little by little, until he realized that he was standing alone in a world that was supposed to be an opportunity to start again, but instead became the place that made clearer than ever that what he carried from before could not be easily left behind. And as the months at Lazio continued to pass, what Paul Gascoigne lost was not only stable form, but the feeling of belonging somewhere, something he had lacked from long before he set foot in Italy. After the lonely months in Italy, when the feeling of being lost had taken root in every habit, Paul Gascoigne left Lazio to step into a new chapter in Scotland with Rangers. And this time, unlike before, he was welcomed like someone returning from a storm, like a star that still had the chance to relight the light that had gradually dimmed. Right from the first days, Rangers fans saw again a familiar part of Gascoigne: delicate ball handling, sudden explosive moments, creative passes that no one else could create, as if the talent in him had never disappeared, only been covered by years of chaos. And on the pitch, there were times he truly came back to life, truly found again the joy of playing football that he had once lost, making a major contribution to helping Rangers win domestic titles, becoming an important part of the team, and bringing beautiful memories to the fans about a player they once believed could change every match with just one moment. But behind the stadium lights and the cheers, his life off the pitch continued to slide in a different direction. No longer the fragile balance as before, but a loss of control that became clearer and clearer. Alcohol continued to become an inseparable part of daily life, no longer just a way to cope with pressure or pain, but gradually becoming a habit, a dependence he could not escape. And the more success he had on the pitch, the deeper the contradiction inside him became, because every victory only brought temporary joy, quickly erased when he returned to the silence of himself. In the locker room, he could still laugh, could still create a positive atmosphere, but when he returned alone, the voids opened again, and no applause could fill them, no title could keep him in a stable state. Gascoigne's life at this time was like two parallel worlds, one world on the pitch where he was still a genius, where people still called his name with admiration, and one world in real life where he had to face himself, with uncontrolled emotions, with inexplicable swings. And that very separation made everything more dangerous, because his talent was big enough to hide the problem for a long time, enough to make others believe that everything was still okay, but not enough to heal what was happening inside. There were matches where he shone brilliantly, became the center of every ball, brought victory to the team, but right after that came days when he seemed to disappear from his own life, falling into negative habits, decisions no one could understand. And gradually, the image of an unstable Gascoigne began to become more familiar than the image of a genius. Gascoigne. The painful thing was that even when he achieved success, even when he won titles, the stability he always sought still did not appear, because the problem had never been in football, but in the person himself, in the wounds from the past that had never been healed, in the emotional voids that had existed long before he became a professional player. And at Rangers, that became clearer than ever. Talent could help him win matches, but could not help him win against himself. And as the years passed, the boundary between revival and collapse continued to blur again, leaving a brilliant yet heartbreaking image of a man that the world once believed could conquer everything, but could not find peace even in his own life. After those years that seemed to have found back a part of the light at Rangers, Paul Gascoigne's life stepped into a new chapter, where football was no longer the only center, and where personal emotions began to take over all the remaining space inside him. That was the time he met Cheryl, the woman who later became his wife. And in some moment of his chaotic life, love appeared like a rare ray of light, a hope that perhaps he could still build something stable outside the pitch. At first, that relationship carried warmth, care, and the feeling of belonging that Gascoigne had lacked since childhood. He found in it a feeling that football had never been able to completely replace, the feeling of being seen not as a player, but as a human being. And that very thing made him decide to go further, to marriage, with the hope that love could help him keep the balance that football life always pushed him away from. But reality was not that simple, because what had not been healed inside him did not disappear just because of the presence of another person. And when married life began, the old cracks gradually showed again. At first, they were small misunderstandings, arguments stemming from pressure from emotional instability, from the days he came home in an unpredictable state, sometimes cheerful, sometimes silent, sometimes explosive. And gradually, those conflicts were no longer rare but became a familiar part of married life. The atmosphere in the family began to change, from the initial warmth to tension, from hope to fatigue, and in those moments, the boundary between love and hurt began to blur. Because Gascoigne not only brought his personal problems into the relationship, he brought an entire long history of unresolved wounds, emotions suppressed since childhood, pressures from his career, and also the growing dependence on alcohol as a way to cope with everything. When alcohol appeared more in daily life, it not only affected his health or career, but also changed the way he reacted to those around him. Especially in the closest relationship, the arguments became more intense. Words spoken in moments of lost control left wounds that were not easy to erase, and over time, the initial love began to deform into a different emotion, where care was replaced by worry, where closeness was replaced by distance, and where trust was gradually eroded by unstable behaviors. The moments of violence and loss of control did not appear as a single event, but as part of a long chain of stressful days, where no one really knew what would happen next, and that very thing made family life heavier than ever. For Cheryl, the love that once existed was gradually replaced by fatigue and fear. For Gascoigne, every passing day was a battle between the desire to be loved and the helplessness in controlling himself. And in the silences after each conflict, he often fell into deep regret, realizing that what had just happened was not what he wanted, but at the same time he was not capable enough to change it immediately. That torment became a familiar cycle, where mistakes, regret, and helplessness kept repeating without a clear way out. The family gradually fell apart not because of a single incident, but because of the accumulation of many small moments, words that could not be taken back, actions that could not be erased. And when the relationship officially broke down, what remained was not relief, but a deeper feeling of emptiness. Because Gascoigne not only lost a marriage, he lost another chance to stabilize his life. And in the silence after everything, he began to understand that what was happening was not only the consequence of the present, but the result of an entire long journey that he had never really had the chance to stop, to look back, and to change before everything became too late. After the marriage Cheryl fell apart, after the years when love gradually turned into fear and hurt, Paul Gascoigne's life no longer had any clear anchor, and it was precisely in that void that alcohol was no longer a passing choice, but became the center of his entire existence, something that both soothed the inner pains and slowly eroded the person he once was. At first, it was only times of drinking to forget the pressure, to ease unbearable memories, to blur the feeling of emptiness after the stadium lights went out. But over time, alcohol was no longer a tool, but became a need, a reflex, the only way he could face himself without completely collapsing. And the most dangerous thing was that it did not come like a sudden collapse, but like a slow flow, creeping into every habit, every day of life, every small decision, until it became an inseparable part of his life. And when that happened, everything began to change in a way that could not be reversed. In those years, Rangers and the memories of the peak of his career were no longer enough to hold him back. The fame he once had was gradually replaced by headlines about instability, about appearances in an uncontrolled state, about behaviors that made the public both sympathetic and disappointed. And each time like that, a familiar cycle played out again. A period of trying to stay sober, a time of treatment, a small hope that everything could change, then afterward, a relapse, quick and cruel, as if his body and mind no longer had the ability to resist what had taken root deep inside. The rehabilitation centers became part of his journey, not as a place of complete healing, but as temporary stops in a long battle with no end, where he tried to find control again but always lost it right after. Every time he entered the hospital was a time of facing the rawest reality about himself, when there was no more pitch, no more lights, no more applause, only a person left to look in the mirror and admit that everything had gone further than what he could control by himself. The doctors, the experts, the people around all tried to help. But the problem was not only physical, but lay at a deeper level, where old wounds, childhood memories, the pressures of fame and accumulated loneliness formed into a block that could not be easily separated. And so, every treatment effort was only like soothing the surface of a storm that continued to form inside. The relapse did not come as a single failure, but as an inevitable part of the vortex he was caught in. There were periods when he tried to return to sobriety, tried to train, tried to appear in public with a more positive image. But all it took was a small pressure, an old memory, or simply prolonged silence, and everything collapsed again. And alcohol once more became the familiar refuge, where all emotions were blurred for a short time, but the price paid was always much greater than that temporary relief. Because each time like that, he lost another part of the public's trust, another part of career opportunities, and most importantly, a part of confidence in himself. Financially, those unstable years began to leave clear traces. The once very large incomes from the peak were gradually depleted by treatment costs, by an unstable lifestyle, by decisions that were no longer clear-headed, and when fame was no longer strong enough to protect him from reality, Gascoigne had to face a world where he had once stood at the peak, but now became strange and harsh. Job invitations gradually decreased. Public appearances no longer carried honor, but were often tied to curiosity about his condition, and that created a new vortex, where financial pressure and mental pressure fed each other, pushing him deeper into instability. His health began to decline noticeably, not only physically but also mentally. The signs of exhaustion became clearer over time. Sleep was no longer stable. Anxiety attacks appeared frequently, and the ability to maintain focus or emotional balance gradually disappeared. Meanwhile, the outside world still remembered him as a legend, a player who could create magic with just one moment. But the contrast between the public image and the reality of his personal life became increasingly painful, because the more he was remembered as an icon, the more he had to face a larger gap between the glorious past and the fragile present. The most tragic thing was not that he was addicted to alcohol, but that alcohol gradually became the only way he could endure himself, a parallel existence between the person once admired by the whole world and a person trying to survive day by day. And in that struggle, there was no clear victory, no definitive ending, only the continuation of a prolonged inner battle where every sober day was an effort, and every collapse was a new cut on a life journey that already had too many wounds, leaving the image of a man who was not only defeated by circumstances, but also by what he had carried inside from long before the world knew his name. As the dependence on alcohol increasingly became the center of life, Paul Gascoigne was no longer just fighting with himself in silence, but began to step into another, more brutal phase, where every collapse took place before the public's eyes. And from that point on, his life was no longer a private journey, but became a story exposed piece by piece before the media, where every mistake, every moment of lost control was recorded, analyzed, and widely spread. There was no longer any distance between the real person and the public image, because everything now was dragged into the light without mercy, and that very change turned his life into a particularly cruel form of existence. The media, which had once honored him as a football genius, now began to follow him with a completely different perspective, no longer focusing on plays or moments on the pitch, but on unstable appearances, sidelined images, stories about mental health, and unstable behavior. And every article, every news segment contributed to rebuilding Gascoigne's image in an increasingly negative direction, not as a person fighting illness or trauma, but as a symbol of decline. And in that process, he gradually lost control over the story about himself because what the world saw was no longer decided by him. Before the public, his image changed noticeably, from a player once admired for his natural talent to a character who frequently appeared in stories about personal tragedy. And the painful thing was that that change did not happen in one moment, but accumulated gradually over time. Through each unstable appearance, through each undated image, through each story retold without full context, causing the public to gradually form a fixed view, where he was no longer a complete person, but only repeated moments of weakness. Mockery began to appear alongside pity, and in many cases, these two emotions existed side by side, creating an extremely uncomfortable environment for anyone who had to live in it. Because on one hand, he was seen as a symbol of failure, on the other hand, he was mentioned as a legend who had lost himself. And in that contradiction, there was no room for normality, no space for him to simply be a person trying to live through each day. Instead, there was a distorted image, constantly recreated before millions of people without his consent. The feeling of being exposed became an unavoidable part of daily life, where every time he appeared in public carried heavy pressure, not only because of what he was going through, but also because of what others expected to see in him. And that expectation no longer related to football, but to collapse, as if the public was waiting for more moments of weakness to confirm a story that had already been said. And that very thing made Gascoigne fall into a deeper state of lost control, because he no longer felt he was being seen as a human being, but as an image for others to judge. In all of that, loneliness became the dominant state, not loneliness in the physical sense, but loneliness right in the middle of the world's attention, because the more famous he became, the less space he had to be himself, the more widely known he was, the less he felt truly understood. And that paradox made fame become a burden instead of a privilege, when every step of his was followed, every mistake was remembered, and every effort to stand up was placed under doubtful eyes, making him gradually withdraw into a world that no one could really step into. And in that silence, between the lights of fame and the darkness of personal life, Paul Gascoigne was no longer the symbol of joy on the pitch as before, but became a person trying to exist in a space where he no longer had the right to define, where the glorious past and the fragile present constantly collided, creating a reality that was both painful and impossible to escape. And that very thing turned his life into one of the clearest, tragic stories about the price of fame when it did not come with protection for the person inside. In the years surrounded by the media and non-stop judgment, Paul Gascoigne did not completely give up. And amid those chaotic days, there were still moments when he tried to stand up, tried to find a version of himself not dominated by alcohol, by the past, or by the mistakes that had accumulated over time. The efforts to quit drinking began to appear like fragile bright spots in a journey that had already had too much darkness, where he participated in treatment programs, support centers, periods of separation from the old environment, with the hope that a change of space could help change the person inside. And in some moments, that seemed to work. He could be more sober, could talk more clearly, could appear in public with a gentler image, as if a part of the old person was gradually returning. In those periods, people could see a different Gascoigne, not completely swallowed by the old problems. A person who could smile without forcing it, who could talk about football with bright eyes instead of fatigued. And those moments made many people believe that perhaps he still had a chance, that perhaps this journey had not completely ended in the worst direction. But the very fragility of those improvement periods made everything more heartbreaking because they did not last, were not stable and often existed only as short silences between two violent waves. The treatment programs gave him a temporary structure where he could stay away from alcohol, away from the factors that made everything worse, but they could not completely change what had taken root inside him from many years before, because the problem was not only in behavior, but in emotions, in memories, in wounds that had never been resolved. And when he left the controlled environment, when he returned to the outside world, where there was no continuous supervision, no support structure, everything gradually returned to the old way, slowly but surely. The relapse did not come as a single shock, but as a repeating process that he seemed unable to break. Every new start carried hope. Every fall carried disappointment. And gradually, that very cycle became a familiar part of his life, where effort and failure existed side by side, neither completely winning and neither completely disappearing, making his life like a chain of days constantly swinging between light and darkness. The people around him, from friends, old teammates to experts, all saw the danger of this cycle, but breaking it had never been simple, because every relapse was not only the return of an old habit, but also the return of all the emotions he had tried to avoid, the painful memories, the mental pressures, the deep feelings of loneliness that no short-term treatment program could completely erase. And so, every effort to stand up became even heavier, because it was not only starting again, but facing again all the things that had once made him collapse. There were short periods when Gascoigne truly progressed. He could maintain sobriety for a long enough time to create hope, could participate in community activities, could appear in football events with a more positive image. And in those moments, people saw a different person, a person who still had the ability to connect, still had warmth, still had beautiful memories of football, not completely obscured by the past. But those periods were always short, like small rays of light between a cloudy sky. What made the cycle impossible to escape was not only physical dependence, but also the deep connection between alcohol and the way he faced himself. Because every time he faced two strong emotions, emptiness or pressure, he turned to what was most familiar, and that very familiarity made change extremely difficult. Because it was not only a habit, but a distorted survival mechanism that had existed for too long. And in all those efforts, the most heartbreaking thing was not that he failed many times, but that he always tried, always came back, always tried to stand up, even knowing that the chance of falling again was very high. And that very exhausting persistence made Paul Gascoigne's story not only about collapse, but also about a man trapped in his own battle, where victory was never complete, and failure was never the end. After many years caught in the endless cycle between hope and collapse, Paul Gascoigne's life stepped into another phase, where the spotlight was no longer as bright as before, and the days after the peak became a long journey of instability, with no more peak matches to define himself, no more uplifting moments to cover the cracks inside, only a person left to learn how to live with the consequences of an entire life full of upheaval. And in that shift, everything seemed to slow down but become heavier. His health began to weaken noticeably over time, not only because of the accumulated injuries from his playing career, but also because of the long years under the influence of alcohol and mental pressure. His body no longer kept the flexibility as before. The pains appeared more frequently. Sleep became unstable, and every passing day carried a prolonged feeling of fatigue, as if the body itself was reflecting all that the mind had had to endure for many years. And that made daily life become a chain of small efforts to maintain the fragile balance. In personal life, Gascoigne's family relationships also went through many ups and downs, with no more stability or lasting connection, as people usually expected. The relationships that once brought hope now became more complicated because of the past, because of unresolved wounds, and because of the lasting influence of the unstable years. Nevertheless, there was still a certain thread connecting him with close people, people who did not completely abandon him, but also could not completely pull him out of the difficulties he was facing. and that very interweaving between closeness and distance created a prolonged emotional state, unclear, inconclusive. Amid all that chaos, there were still rare moments of peace, seconds when he could sit quietly, could smile naturally, could feel again a small part of the safety he had lost from long ago, perhaps in a short conversation, in a simple meeting, or in moments of returning to football in a gentler way, with no more playing pressure, no more heavy expectations, only memories and pure emotions left. But those moments were always short, like small rays of light between a cloudy sky. What was particularly heartbreaking in this period was not a new collapse, but the complete absence of a stable state, because Gascoigne's life no longer had clear extremes as before, no longer clear peaks or sudden abysses, but instead a prolonged oscillation where everything existed in a halfway state, not good enough to call recovery, but not bad enough to end, making life become a journey with no clear stopping point. The people who had known him from the peak saw a different person, slower, quieter, carrying traces of time and experiences not easy to name. But there was still a part of the person who once made entire stadiums explode, a part still alive in the eyes, in the way he talked about football, in the memories he never completely lost. And that very parallel existence created an image that was both familiar and strange. There was no clear ending point for this period, because Gascoigne's life did not follow a straight line, but was like a slow flow, where every day was a continuation of what had happened before, where the past never really left, and the present was always influenced by what had once been. And in that flow, the feeling of stability became a luxury he had never really achieved. When looking back at the entire journey, what remained was not the titles or glorious moments, but the image of a man who had lived a life full of upheaval, always trying to find balance but never really touching it. A life where peace was not the destination, but only short moments, interspersed between long, unbroken waves, leaving a feeling that was both pitiful and quiet about a journey that had never really found a stopping place. Even though Paul Gascoigne's life went through countless events, from brilliant peaks to periods full of instability, one thing that never disappeared was the affection that fans had for him, an affection not based on perfection or stability, but built from the most genuine moments he had once brought on the pitch, where his talent once made the whole world stand up, not because of calculation or mechanical discipline, but because of pure emotion, because of instinctive plays, because of the way he turned matches into a living art that no one could copy. The fans remembered Gascoigne not only as a player, but as a part of English football memory, a symbol of the era when emotion still played the central role, where the tears at the 1990 World Cup were not seen as weakness, but became part of a shared story, where the goal against Scotland at Euro 1996 was not only a technical moment, but a collective memory that could not be erased. And those very moments made him special, not because of the number of titles, but because of the feeling he left in the hearts of viewers. But the affection for Gascoigne did not only come from what he did on the pitch, but also from a deep empathy with the person behind the spotlight, a person who had to face psychological wounds from very early, with loneliness, with pressures that never stopped, and with inner battles that lasted throughout his life. When fans began to look deeper, they no longer only saw an inconsistent player, but saw a person struggling to exist in his own life. And that made the initial admiration turn into a form of understanding, sometimes pity, but also full of respect. Gascoigne's image, therefore, was never a perfect image, and never needed to be perfect to be loved, because that very imperfection made him closer to ordinary people. People who also stumbled at times, also lost direction at times, also had pains that could not be expressed. And in him, they saw an exaggerated version of those very emotions, a person who had lived all those things at a level that few could imagine. Over time, as his career gradually receded, what remained was not the controversies or the negative moments once emphasized by the media, but the memory of a player who could change the rhythm of a match with just one moment, one pass, one unpredictable handling. And those memories became the foundation for lasting affection, surpassing even the ups and downs of his personal life. Because in Gascoigne's case, football was not only achievement, but emotion. His honesty, whether in shining moments or moments of weakness, became the factor that made him different. Because he was never a perfectly constructed image, but always a person full of contradictions who could amaze people one day and worry them the next. But that very truth made him irreplaceable in the memory of the fans, because what is genuine always leaves a longer-lasting mark than what is perfect. Even when his life went through many difficult periods, the fans still mentioned him, not with a judgmental attitude, but with an increasingly deep understanding, as if time had helped them see more clearly the person behind the player. And in that view, Gascoigne was no longer a simple story of failure or success, but a journey of a person who had lived fully with his emotions, even though that sometimes made him pay a very high price. And that was exactly why his image was never only the image of a football legend, but also the image of an imperfect but real person. A person who had left a mark not only with titles, but with emotion, with honesty, and with moments that made the whole world stop to feel, to understand that behind every spotlight there always existed a human story much deeper than what people saw on the surface. Looking back at Paul Gascoigne's entire journey, people cannot just stop at the titles or the explosive moments on the pitch, but are forced to face a more painful truth. This is the story of a person carrying rare talent, but having to live almost his entire life in a battle with his own inner self. From the image of the boy in Gateshead, witnessing loss too early, to the tears at the 1990 World Cup, then the injury at the 1991 FA Cup that made his body begin to betray him, all were not just a series of sports events, but long psychological cuts accumulating over time. When he went to Italy to wear the Lazio jersey and then returned to the peak with Rangers, the world saw a genius, but did not see the growing loneliness behind the lights, the collapse in marriage, the alcohol addiction vortex, the times of quitting then relapsing, and the exposure before the media had turned his life into a public tragedy that no one could really stop in time. The most heartbreaking thing was not that he fell many times, but that he always tried to stand up in silence, even though no stability was waiting ahead. From the American cultural perspective, this story is a clear reminder that success is never enough without mental health and proper support systems. People like Gascoigne do not only need admiration, but need understanding and early intervention before talent is swallowed by pressure and trauma. In real life, the lesson here is to learn to see a person as a whole, not only through spotlight or failure, but through the small signs of pain that they do not speak out. And more importantly, understand that sometimes what people need most is not more pressure to be stronger, but a patient hand to help them not have to fight alone in battles that even they do not fully understand. If Paul Gascoigne's story has touched your heart, please hit subscribe so we can continue to explore the tear-filled journeys behind the spotlight of legends. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to tell stories that time will never fade.